hand. We've got Johnny, Clay, Dean, Cameron Burnside, Dan Kennedy. If you guys want to come up and we'll get this party started.
Give him a hand. Yes.
And I'll have you guys just pass.
We got a packed room today. Why are you guys here?
You guys pass the mic to
Dean, to see Dean, I get it. Well, what are you guys coming for?
It's higher.
So we're going to dump into this. So we have like 45-ish minutes to go through that. I'm assuming this is why you all showed up. Make sure we're clearing all the changes. August 17th is coming very quickly. Who's pumped for changes? A few of you. Who's terrified of changes? A few of you. Who doesn't like to vote? Raise your hand. Yes. All right. You voted 3 times, Jason. Okay. Awesome. Well, let's get rocking into this. So Dean screenshotted a bunch of the new forms. So we're going to kind of talk about the contract aspect of this. I invited 3 superstars as well, primarily because over my career in real estate, I've noticed that you 3 are probably some of the most scripted and practiced on what you communicate with clients. I know at least Cameron up here and Dan were big Mike Ferry guys back in the day. So they not only memorize, internalize scripts, they've really built a career with internalizing of scripts. Dan's smiling, which means he's gone away from scripts over the last couple of years. But let's kick it off. And if you guys don't even mind introducing yourselves real quick, and then just how long have you been in real estate? Just number of years you've been in real estate. We'll start with you, Cameron. Go ahead.
Cameron Burnside, 20 years.
20 years. Happy anniversary.
Clay Winder, 17 years.
Dan Kennedy, 17 years as well.
And Dean, and I've been 22 years now.
Great, great. So I'm going to throw just a total random question out there before we jump into this content. You guys having been in the industry at least 17 or longer years, what is not this commission change, the lawsuit, not this current environment, what was the biggest change, if you look back over your career, what is the biggest industry change that you remember happening over the last 17, 20, 22 years? And maybe how did that go about for you? Like, what's the biggest change that you feel like we faced as an industry, in your opinion, before all these changes? We don't have to go in a row, but whoever's got an answer first. You remember a big change?
I'll say, in addition to COVID, we kind of hit that little speed bump. This is a change that has maybe cycled through. It's not something that's happened just one time. But I remember being in the business almost 20 years ago, and I got into it, and I was very excited about what we were doing. And then all of a sudden, I heard about this company, ARI. Dean, do you remember them? It was a discount brokerage. Basically paid $200. You put a sign out front. And when I first heard about that, I thought, we're screwed. Like, we're never going to make money in this business. And it really scared me because I thought, there's no way we can compete with that. And I remember having a conversation with my broker at the time that was really powerful. And he said, these types of conversations have always been happening. He said that he remembered when he was in a room several years before that, and Bill Gates was a speaker. He was a presenter in that room. And Bill Gates told this group of business owners, the internet will destroy the real estate community and you'll never have real estate agents again. So I think just the idea behind that is that even though things change, things have always been the same in that regard.
Cool. Well, it's a big change, Dean.
Probably the biggest change that I've seen. I remember, man, I was really good. I saved all of my contracts on DVD. Why are you laughing? That was cutting edge. I would literally scan everything, save it to not a floppy, but to literally to a drive, a thumb drive, and then run it to my computer and put it on my hard drive. And then every month I would save them because I wasn't going to have file cabinets. But data has really driven this business. It's very different. Probably the biggest change we've seen is the portals out there. I know that we whine about Zillow. We complain about how they as a company have done business. Now they're a brokerage. And so I'm not here to badmouth a brokerage. I know we're being recorded. I think that the biggest one we need to worry about is CoStar. And you're going to see who's the gorilla in the room. There's always going to be someone that's going to try and disrupt the industry and try and change it. This is certainly a speed bump, but it hasn't changed. It's not going to change dramatically a lot of things we're already doing in business.
Cool. Clay, Dan?
I'll just add real quick.
Probably the biggest change for me early on was syndication. Like Dean said, when I got into the business, you would have to manually put your listing on every individual website. And so within a couple of years, there was a third-party company that said, put your listing into our system and we will, for you on your behalf, syndicate it to 8 other websites. And so the fact that the MLS got on board, KWLS is like, you guys probably don't even use it a whole lot, but that used to be like, you'd have to put in KWS to syndicate. So the data certainly was the biggest change. In terms of contracts, I don't think we pay attention to, there's actually a lot of little changes that happen over the year. They used to provide warranties, like the seller would warrant the home. And so that was a big change early on when they said, hey, from now on, every home in Utah sold as is. Like right now, all of us are like, duh, why would it not be as is? But there was a time not that long ago when it wasn't as is. You would have to actually declare if the seller was going to like come back and fix stuff, or if you were going to use a third party home warranty, or if it truly was as is. And I remember that kind of made made a little bit of a splash. And then probably more recently, the big change, and I think will be kind of a basis for a lot of this conversation, is it wasn't that long ago when we'd say, you never talk about commissions ever, ever, ever in a purchase contract. You'd get your hand slapped if you put anything in an addendum that talked about commissions. That all needs to be done outside of the Rep C in the form of escrow instructions or outside agreements. And then one night we all woke up and said, no, there's actually an addendum now that if you want to request more BAC, you can, and you can and should talk about it in the Rep C. And this was only a few years ago. And now here we are today where it has to be discussed in the purchase contract or you ain't getting paid.
Dan, can you think of any?
Not necessarily anything that hasn't been mentioned, other than like I'm not really all that concerned about changes in the marketplace or changes in this or the changes in that, because the reality is it's still the person you see in the mirror who every morning is what's actually going to make the difference for you and your business. And if you're getting too caught up in the, this is changing or that's changing or just the emotions of it, then you're really not going to be putting yourself in the right position to succeed. So just try not to get too caught up on that stuff and just keep your mind right.
Yeah. I think that was the first point why I asked this is I made a list last night when I was thinking about what were major changes in the industry I've seen over the last 17 years that in the moment I said the words, holy crap, like, holy crap, this is going to be big. And like every one of those in hindsight and looking back felt like more like a speed bump, So I think the quote that I've said a bunch of times is nothing's ever as good as it seems. Nothing's ever as bad as it seems, So I think hang in there. I appreciate you all being here so we can get informed on this. There is going to be some very applicable forms that we'll cover that you've heard about that will be changing. And then I really just wanted to discuss with them, not only their point of views, like how they see this playing out, but also the way that they're communicating each one of these steps or contracts or whatever with their clientele. So if you're like me, it has been inbox inundation of settlement changes. Pretty much every day I've got something from a different organization or a news outlet or something. And it's been very, very loud, even though it's all just the same things being retold over and over to catch, some viewers on it. I even had to create a Google label just to get them out of my inbox. So I called it settlement, and I've just been putting them in there. So a lot of changes. So if you don't mind, let's actually start with the forms, if we don't mind going through the forms and actually just being totally clear on what are the August 17th changes. I know Dean's covered these a bunch of times. We record the team meetings. I know everybody in the room goes back and watches the team meeting recording several times throughout the week, Novely including. So we'll cover the actual technical changes, the form changes, and then we're going to jump into just the scripts, communication, the different pieces of the service cycle of buyers and sellers, and how are we communicating these and having those conversations. And then we'll look in the future, and you guys can do your predictions of how you see all this playing out, okay? So let's start with the forms, Dean. I know you threw all these in, and I know you guys research forms, so you guys are welcome to jump in, but you want to just maybe take it away with the clicker and kind of just talk about the forms now that you've got the secret view of them.
The secret sauce. I'll look at this form over here. I just cut out pieces of the most important forms. We have Amber, who's on the forms committee, so please feel free to jump in anytime, especially when I mess up.
We got an extra chair.
Come on down now. All right, really quick, in the exclusive right to sell listing agreement, these are the most pertinent paragraphs, talks about the compensation. there are 3 paragraphs, if you will, 3 subparts, if you will, of section 2 of the contract. First is what you charge. Up here in the brokerage fee, what are you charging for your listing services? Take a quick step back to a Ben Kinney script I heard. He said, now look, my brokerage charge is 3%. Now, excuse me, I'm going to change my language. Stole this from the CEO down in St. George. We're going to talk about bananas. I charge 3 bananas to service your listing and to list your property. Using Ben Kinney's script, I charge 3 bananas. Now what we're going to negotiate is how many bananas do you want to pay for a buyer's agent, or do we want to offer to a buyer's agent that my brokerage will pay or you will pay, to that buyer's brokerage. And so that was one of his scripts. He used it. I'm going to throw a twist in it though. We talked about it last week, and if you read the script or read the slide, very quickly it said you can never negotiate up, but you can negotiate down. Okay. So you may say, I charge 6 bananas to list your home. That's all it is. For all the services that I've explained, everything I'm going to do, it's going to cost you 6 bananas. The second subsection paragraph here is an authorization. The seller is going to authorize me as a listing agent how many bananas we can offer to compensate a buyer's brokerage. And so we may put 3 bananas, we may put 2 bananas, we may put somewhere 2 1/4, 2 1/2 bananas. It doesn't matter. That's what the seller authorizes. Are there any questions on that? 2 very separate payments. One is what's going to be paid to the listing brokerage. Go ahead, Amber. Yeah, and it's up to that amount because it doesn't mean that we're going to pay that, but the seller's willing to authorize me as a listing agent to advertise up to that amount. It cannot be advertised on the MLS. Okay. And then the last one, 2.3, I think can be the most confusing paragraph in it all. If the broker is going to pay for it, so let's say that, again, I'm charging 6 bananas for my work. We're going to put 3 bananas, we're just using hypotheticals, in 2.2. It says if the brokerage, if KW Westfield is going to pay the buyer's brokerage, that commission, those 3 bananas in 2.2 are going to be added to 2.1. And now there's 9 bananas that are owed to the listing brokerage. Now, a lot of folks are going to freak out and go, wait, 9 bananas to sell a house? Well, that's what this agreement has done. And so what you may choose to do is say, add an addendum, there's an addendum to the exclusive right to sell, and say, the way we've worked it out, though, is the seller will not pay more than, I'm just picking a number, 5 bananas on that. Does that kind of make sense for all of you? I want to give you one example too. In this brokerage, I don't allow for dual agency. You may not represent both sides. Well, some people will say, right now in the environment in which we work, if I'm charging 6 bananas to list a property and I have an unrepresented buyer come because I don't allow dual agency, I may choose to discount the number of bananas that I'm charging to list that property. But if I'm only charging 3 bananas in this case, I can't add a banana because I want to take more money because I'm working a little bit more to help an unrepresented buyer.
Dean, I think it'd actually be more effective to let each form guide the conversation. So maybe let's just stop there before we go to the next one, and then let's just have the discussion on this specific topic and let the form guide it. So maybe the rest of the panel, when you look at these changes here, Dean, talk, when you think about how you behaved with sellers when the word commission or the point of your listing precinct popped up, that the commission discussion and how buyer agents and all that versus the changes that have happened and how you're moving forward. Let's just have that conversation, and you're welcome to, speculate in your opinions on any of it. So go ahead, Dean.
A couple thoughts that I've had are, I don't think I'm going to do much speaking in terms of like my brokerage fee is this, because the reality is if it's a 5% listing, my brokerage fee is 5%. We're choosing to offer whatever to the cooperating agent if there is one. And there's going to be a lot more instances, I feel like moving forward, that there's just simply not going to be a cooperating agent. And it's going to be an opportunity where buyers think just because they come to the table that they're like bypassing whatever BBC percentage that they no longer even are aware of anymore. And it leaves a judgment call between listing agent and seller, what's becoming of that, whatever that percentage was. And I feel like unrepresented buyers are just going to become extremely common, and we need to be prepared for our conversations with them and with the sellers, just so sellers aren't caught off guard and say, oh, well, I thought your fee was only 2.5%. You're telling me it's 5%, whether they have an agent or not, or 6% or whatever. And so that's kind of my thought on that situation.
So I don't know what the stat is now, percent of, transactions that the buyer is represented, but it's really high, like 90-something%, right? You think that's going to be lower, that less buyers are going to come in represented, like they're going to come straight to the car dealership, basically.
Absolutely.
And you think there's going to be an increase in listing agents' commission average percentage because of the likelihood of getting the full 5%?
It's going to be an opportunity to get more of the commission. Absolutely.
Okay.
That's what I'm not opposed to unrepresented buyers at all.
Yeah.
I'll go open the door for them. And if they're mistaken, if they're thinking that they're just going to like be pocketing whatever the BAC
The difference
is,
yeah.
it's just kind of an education matter.
And we're going to flip hats. So we have our listing agent hat on right now, right? So we'll go back to buyer's agent. But Clay, Cameron, do you guys want to comment on this? Your scripts, how you're handling these conversations, what you think is going to change?
Yeah, I think Dan's right. We're going to have more buyers go unrepresented. I think we'll talk more about that because they're going to be presented with the BBA. This listing agreement, though, it says very clearly, as you can see on here, I charge a listing. I'll back up. A listing agent will present to their seller, simply stated, hey, I charge 3% for my listing side, and I recommend there in paragraph 2.2 that we prepare ourselves to accept an offer that might be contingent upon us paying up to 3%. I'm getting a lot of hands. What's up? Can you guys not hear us? You can't hear us? I can just talk closer. Is that better? You guys are like waving us down like there's a fire in the back. Okay. So that being said, I think it is important as you read this document, if you want the experience that Dan just described, where the listing agent can take more commission, correct me if I'm wrong, Dean, you will have to have an addendum. Amber, correct me. To unbundle, that's what I'm saying. You'd have to have an addendum if you have a variable rate.
But if we offer a better because that's what you can't unbundle those.
So the major intent of the change of the form was to unbundle the commission from being together. So there is a clear listing agent commission, and then if there is an offer of buyer compensation.
And it's important, you said earlier, that last line under 2.2 says that it cannot exceed that. So if I'm a listing agent, I've only put 2%, and then I get the most perfect offer, but they're asking for 3%, it's my understanding that I would need to renegotiate my ERS, or at least update my ERS if we want to partake in that.
Seller can choose to be.
Right.
Okay, Cameron?
I think there's a lot of unknowns with all of this, what's happening.
Sure.
I think I have felt a definite uptick maybe in the last 2 or 3 years when even before any of this started, when I would get calls from buyers who were saying, I'm just wanting to work with the listing agent. Would you guys say that you've seen the same thing? I mean, it's been noticeable. I wouldn't say it's a majority. I wouldn't say it's every time, but it's definitely been more the last couple of years than what it has been years leading up to that, in my opinion. I think that's probably one of the biggest questions that I have of all this is what will happen to the buyer agency situation. I think there's always going to be people out there that have no idea what they're doing. They're scared to death. They're first-time home buyers. They want the help. It'll be really curious to see what percentage start to say we're going directly to the listing agent and bypass the buyer's agent. But I think regardless of what the change is, because we won't know that until we start getting into it, I think regardless of what happens, this is the tried and true answer to almost everything, which is that value proposition.
Mhm.
I think if you're working with those buyers, there's a good way to turn some of those buyers who were going to go directly to that listing agent and say, let's talk about why, from my perspective, I would recommend you consider working with me as your buyer's agent, because I think you put that proper buyer proposition together and it's going to change a lot of mindsets out there within the community. And that's part of our job, is to be the local economist of choice and to be the educator and the advisors to make sure that we can say, hey, we're not just going to lay down and kind of say goodbye to the buyer agency. Let's fight for it and let's tell people this is why we can do it. Because I think we'll still see a good number of people being represented by
Yeah.
agents personally.
Mhm. So, one question I have on the seller side, which, the first time this hit the news, specifically just being around Claymore, you got calls or emails within hours of sellers wanting to renegotiate their ERS because they assumed all this just meant them saving money, right? So how has that those conversations transpired the last, couple months or even moving forward?
Yeah, I think a lot of us did when the news really kind of misled the conversation around this. It made it seem like the BAC just went away, and it didn't. It just is negotiable, which it always has been, but we have not done a good job as a realtor community communicating that it's negotiable. So it does just take education. That's why the language we should have already been using, but we should continue to use when we're presenting this document to our sellers, is that I charge X amount. And I highly recommend that you prepare yourself to pay a buyer's agent, because good offers, working with good buyer's agents, will request it. And it would be naive for us to not assume that. And I think that's probably the part that I am most, I won't use the word fearful, but I'm least looking forward to as a listing agent with this document, is because it's no longer advertised on the MLS or anywhere for that matter. My assumption is come August 18th, almost every showing I have on my listing will be accompanied with some sort of text message saying, hey, we're thinking about an offer. Did you prep your seller to pay the BBA or did you not? And I'm going to have to be in an uncomfortable position offering. It's going to require that conversation on every offer.
Do you think it's going to increase dramatically the likelihood that agents are not prepping any sort of seller in a buyer agent commission scenario? Like, you specifically have been around the block, you've represented hundreds of buyers. Even when this change happened, you felt like an obligation to protect that buyer agent side of the transactions, at your moral compass kind of. But a lot of just new or just, untrained agents, you think you're going to end up in a lot of scenarios that the seller had no conversation prior that.
Tons. This is the mayhem that's about to happen. This is why we have 100 people in this room right now. And that is because you'll have a lot of agents that won't prep the seller for that, or will even kind of lean on and say, hey, I only charge 3%. We'll just see what happens with the buyer's agent. And the sellers might think, oh, this is my opportunity to save money. And then all of a sudden the offers come in and they're not mentally prepared or mathematically prepared to get hit with another 3% or 2.5% or whatever. And now all of a sudden the tug of war during the negotiations is not just between buyer and seller, but it's between buyer and seller and realtor. And I think that's the big change.
Yeah, I think if you look at a transaction and you tell a seller in a listing agreement and listing presentation, this is what you'd expect to net out of this transaction. I can do rough numbers on my head because I use 10% as that number. I would say, expect to pay a brokerage 3 bananas, expect to pay a buyer's brokerage 3 bananas, expect to pay a buyer 3 bananas for their closing costs, and you'll have about a banana for your own closing costs. And again, I use bananas because I don't want to talk about percentages. We're not setting rates. And that's why these forms are super clear. We want to make sure that we discuss it with our clients that way. But you say, yeah, if we have $1 million house, you should expect to walk away with $900,000, less any mortgages that you owe or other encumbrances on the house. And if you start thinking that way, helps prep the sellers, even if they're saying we're going to offer 0, that's fine. That's their prerogative in 2.2 on this form. But just prep them that your costs will be could be upwards of 10%.
Yeah. So your mayhem discussion is basically the listing agents prepping sellers more in advance under the traditional commission pathway. It's almost deferring that commission negotiation to be a part of the negotiation, which is going to create a
Not
heavier
upfront.
negotiate.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
And why would you do that to yourself? That's why I'd really like to deliver the message to all KW agents that you do yourself a big favor if you just do your net sheets the right way upfront at the listing agreement like we've already done. If you defer that to the offer, I just see that really souring the negotiations and almost feeling like a blind side, like a bait and switch. I don't know.
Yeah.
That's kind of the mystery. But
Saran had a question.
yeah, my contracts will have 3 and 3 in
Correct.
those 2 spots.
If a buyer comes unrepresented, 2.2 automatically goes away?
Yep.
Is that like what's happening? That seems to be students.
Yes, that's why, and correct me if I'm wrong, Amber and Nima, that's why I'm saying if you want another commission arrangement, if it's an unrepresented buyer, you will have to have an addendum, which I will have. I intend to do that.
But please understand, you cannot amend it up. There's, and from the attorneys that I've spoken with, if you don't ask for more in your list side, and what I'm saying is that this is what NAR negotiated in their settlement, and I'm not trying to throw NAR under the bus. What I'm saying is the attorneys are saying, if you negotiate up, there's going to be a problem. We'll talk about it in your buyer broker agreement. It's the same thing. If you say, hey, I'll be your buyer's agent for $1. Okay, guess what? You can't negotiate up if there's actually money even being offered. Yeah.
Heck yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
The question is, well, just like a builder scenario, if somebody comes through, they don't have an agent with them, or they're unaccompanied minors. Just understand that that's going to, there, you could lose a buyer, but I guess if they really want to push that narrative, but I don't see that happening. Some builders are going to be that way, and you already know them. But listing agents can pull that, but this isn't about, there is no cooperative compensation. We're going to have to negotiate that compensation. Angie.
Saying not necessarily agreed upon with the seller, can that change, right? So
Yep.
if they come to me directly, just be like, what does that look like? If somebody does come to me directly, does that change? If they.
Does what change, Angie?
The BAC is up, like if BAC is up to 2.5% here.
Okay.
Can that change? If you get a low offer.
Yeah, yeah, everything is negotiable until it's set in, everything's floating until it's set in stone. So when someone comes in, let's say a low offer, we may say the seller's unwilling to pay, 3 bananas on this one. They're unwilling to pay the 2.5 because of the nature of the offer. And so it's a 2-step. This is the first step is with the seller. Then between buyer and seller and agents, there's another agreement that we'll go down that road.
I feel like bananas are a very controversial fruit. I feel like
They are.
apples is a more.
Shall we go apples,
Yeah, let's do
oranges?
apples. Okay, yeah.
Are we monkey?
Brad,
Copy play back together. So on this form, so I think this is relevant. At the top where the percentage is, whatever that fee is. So to try and tie Dean's and Clay's comment together, so we're clear on 2.1, you put whatever full commission you would expect if there's an unrepresented buyer. Down 2.2, you put in what you're offering out. And then to Clay's point, you would do an addendum to this listing at the same time saying, if there's an unrepresented buyer, then the top amount is what it is. But if there's a buyer, then my number in 2.1 drops down to this because you can't negotiate up, because you could put that into an addendum. So if that's the case, I think maybe the brokerage, if we could get some, so not everybody's playing attorney, some boilerplate language or something around that just says, hey, if you want to use this terminology, maybe an attorney looks at it, but says, 2.1 references that and says, this is, whatever, 6 bananas or fruit or whatever Johnny wants it to be at this point. But if there's a buyer's agent involved, this drops down to this amount. Like that's how we want to do it, right?
Right. Okay.
Yes.
Sven.
Yeah, I was gonna say opposite of what I said, because we got to go down. Yep, so that's better.
Okay. So my question goes back to the open house. So when I'm in an open house and somebody comes in without a written buyer broker agreement, and there's not the threshold rule, like what do we do with them? Right?
Yeah, that's pretty simple. Go ahead, Clay.
Well, no, I think this is, I think this is, and we're getting onto the buyer agent side a little bit, and this might be a good segue, but I think this is a huge thing. To go back to Cody's example, a buyer walks into my open house, I'm hosting the open house, I show them the home, do all this, they love it, I do all the selling, and then all of a sudden I get an offer from them, but through a buyer's agent. Why would I not, with my seller, say, hey, you know what? Like, I don't even know who this buyer agent is. I don't know what value they provided. They've asked for a 3%. We should probably just counter offer 1.5 for them, or any at all. Because we procured it through the open house, and there just hasn't been a lot of value. I think that's a conversation that realistically could happen. Therefore, as buyer's agents, we will have to justify our value, not only to our own clients, but in the offer presentation. Like, I represent this buyer, I've got them pre-approved with my preferred lender, I've got them educated and all of these things. I'm delivering to you an awesome offer for your sellers to consider. And that offer costs you a buyer agent commission.
Dan, did you want to hit your script that you threw in there?
This is from a coach I like, Jeff Glover. This is kind of like at the buyer consultation when you're explaining what your buyer agency fee is. So this is something I'm working on. And basically his point is you've got to, or whatever, maybe you're not going over this specifically, but it's based, let me read it. Based on everything we've covered today, do you feel like I can help you secure the right home in a reasonable time frame? Perfect. You're probably wondering what that's going to cost you. The good news is that all of this and everything I do to help buyers secure homes may cost you nothing at all. And here's how. Part of my job is to negotiate the best deal for you. As part of these negotiations, I'm going to ask the seller to contribute, X amount, which should cover all my fees. The better news is you don't have to pay me until I'm getting you new keys at the closing table. Buyer might say, is there any negotiation here? Look, I'm never going to stand in the way of getting a deal done for you. And while that's the minimum fee we charge, my goal is to save you as much money as I can throughout this process. And then, just do some soundbite selling here, give a couple examples of how you've saved somebody a bunch of money somewhere along the way. So the point is not necessarily like what the dialogue is, but like the level of confidence with which you deliver it. Because if you're nervous about what you're telling them, how could you expect them to also not be nervous about what you're saying? And then if it's not delivered well and the entire buyer presentation just goes off smoothly, they're just going to go searching for someone else.
So that transitions us into this new BBA form, right? And to jump back, Clay and I have had this battle going on for like 17 years. He's a relationship-based person. I'm a very task-oriented person. Where's Cameron Wilson? There you are. Okay, he's been witness of all these arguments. Clay's such a relationship guy, and he is always about just earning the business. So very early in his career, buyer brokers were not pushed very early on. Just
It ruins the party. You're like, oh, chummy. And then you're like, yeah, sign this. And it's like a buzzkill. So yeah.
where I was always like, get it signed at the buyer agreement, the buyer appointment, and Clay is so good with people. Very few buyers bailed out on not paying us later on, but it's a little validating to say, all right, we got to sign these at the buyer presentation now. So, all right, Dean, will you walk us through this form?
Let's do this really quick. Would you go down, scroll down the next two more? One more, thanks. Really quick, we talked about it in the listing agreement, and think of it an offer as you're negotiating with the clients. This is where the broker to broker document happens, and this is the agreement. So again, in 2.1, you're talking about what your listing fee is. 2.2 is what we can publicly offer. And then 2.3, if we negotiate that, let's say we negotiated 2 oranges, Johnny. We negotiated that. We're going to put that here in here. It's going to be the 2, and this says 2% of the gross acquisition price of the property. That gets built in. This is the doc that would come with the rep C. So it's saying that there's a broker to broker. This replaces, if you will, the escrow instructions that we saw in the past. Go back one screen if you would. This document would be if the seller is going to pay it in addition to what my brokerage is going to pay. So think of this is the payment addendum. Instead of saying what was advertised on the MLS, it's what was authorized to be offered. If the seller said in 2.2 of the listing agreement, we're going to offer 1 percentage point of the gross purchase price, but the buyer agent the buyer is asking the seller to pay an additional 1 or 1.5. This would be the document that would come with an offer. So I would say this is more the blind one, where you may just say, I want a full 3 or whatever you want in there. Or we have that conversation in advance where all the parties sign that brokerage to brokerage payment addendum or the escrow instructions before. Now let's go back to
Which again, an addendum to the contract now, not a separate document of escrow instruction.
Correct. Well, it's not an addendum. It's just one is an addendum and one is escrow instructions. But it's signed off by both buyer and seller so they can see clearly what's happening.
Okay.
So there you go.
So my impression, what?
Yep.
Josh?
Joshua. Correct. The buyer won't know, but the buyer's going to have to make communication with the listing agent. Gosh, we have to talk to each other. We'll have that conversation in advance.
Why would me as a seller agent ever say, this is what we have on the ERS? Does that make sense? Because that whole part of that document is to say, this is what was offered on the ERS. And so this is in addition to the ERS, right?
But the text up too, so that's such soft language compared to.
So I get your question. You can say, is there compensation available? Yep. There is. And so you can turn it back. What does your buyer broker agreement say? Yeah. What do you have in your buyer broker agreement? Well, it says 2. Great. We can offer 2. No, on the buyer brokers. Anyway.
Hey, if there was a smart business like a smart builder out there, they'd get a big fat billboard on I-15 that says we pay 3%. So all of us as buyers agents don't have to have quite as difficult of a conversation with our buyers when we go. And it would be a big enticement and rally all the buyers agents to send their buyers to that builder. I think you're going to see marketing campaigns outside of the MLS and outside of, these constraints that totally take advantage and boast about being a 3% builder or whoever.
So I used to charge 3% for a buyer, but now it seems like it'd be more advisable to charge 4% and let them know you're going to take care of them. And that if I need to drop down, I would to the 3%, right? In the case of builders offering 4 or 3.5, would it be okay to charge? Charge whatever we want, right?
So let's jump into you're marketing your SOI, you're getting leads, you're meeting a buyer for the first time. Like it seems like the most monumental conversations changing with buyers, right? So let's just before we even go through the BBA, like how are you starting to have this conversation? You have no idea what sellers may or may not pay. You got to make sure that you're going to be compensated. How are you starting these conversations with your buyers in buyer appointments? Go ahead.
So I think this is where it's going to be kind of a growing pain for the industry. So we start to see how much the public really starts to understand about all of this. So I think a really good opening question for a buyer when you sit down is to say something to the effect of, do you know how I get paid? Because that uncovers from the buyer's perspective what they know about what's going on. And some buyers I think are going to be pretty well informed. Some of them may have been following this. Others may have not any idea. And so I think that can start to change your presentation and start to shift how you're going to be explaining this. So I think that's a really good leading question, first of all.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Clay, Dan?
it's just more important than ever to be able to communicate effectively what your value proposition is. You've got to help them understand why you're worth hiring. And buyer's agent commissions are no longer going to be negotiated by the listing agent, in large part. So we've got to step it up, work on our value proposition, work on our communication skills, and only the strongest communicators are going to be able to succeed at a really high level. If you're a poor communicator or you don't, and I'm a poor communicator, I'm horrible at speaking, as you can tell. Well, one-on-one, when you're meeting with your people, you've got to be able to connect with them and help them understand that you're trustworthy and that you care about them, you care about their goals, and that you're going to get the job done for them.
Clay, any comments?
Yeah, I mean,
There's a hand in the back over here.
Buyer has to make up for that, the buyer has to pay X amount on top of what the seller is willing to pay. We run into that. Are there going to be any sort of payment plan options for the brokerage? So the buyer, maybe they don't have all the cash up front and we set them up on some sort of payment plan.
yeah, get it wrapped into their loan. There's their payment plan. I'm serious. Lenders figured out.
So outside of closing the transaction, whether seller offered it, the buyer offered it, will there be any trailing commissions? I haven't even heard.
Yeah, it actually, in the buyer broker agreement, it does, when it talks about compensation, it says that it's due and payable at settlement, when you're closing. And so we'll probably, what's that?
No, it says the buyer.
No, it says that if it's not covered by the seller, the buyer brings whatever's been negotiated, whatever they agree to. Yeah.
Will you hit this form?
Yeah, let's talk about this slide really quick. Two different parts, section 1.
Hey,
Okay.
can I just interject
go right
one
ahead,
thing?
please.
You guys laughed at my comment about lenders figuring it out. Did you not see what VA announced? VA announced that if the sellers are not offering a BBA, they will wrap it into their VA loan. So they're trying to get ahead of it. That came out like a couple of weeks ago. So that's why I mean, like, we might see more and more loan programs that might actually say, hey, as a buyer, first time home buyer incentive, they will, am I right, Eric, or am I
Well, they
mistaken?
increased the threshold.
The lenders
What
are
did they
raising their
say?
hands now.
His comment was right. We'll figure it out. Bring this together, right? Bring
Yep.
this to Close and sell homes, right? So it should be a collaboration between the agents and the lenders, right? To make sure that this happens. A few different things. One, the agencies. Everybody was concerned about, well, if I charge 3% and I have the seller pay for it, it's gonna blow any exceptions out of the water. Not the case.
Wait, stop. Okay. So the first concern that came up was if my buyer has to pay for this and I get the seller to contribute through a concession. I don't know why they would do that, but in the event that you do, the agencies and VA in particular, make it so that whatever your buyer agency commission is, it doesn't count up against your 3 to 6%, well, 3 to 9% cap in concessions. So that gives you a little bit of wiggle room there. If the buyer qualifies and they don't have the funds, it can be just like another closing cost where we can increase the interest rate to give a credit to cover it. We'll figure it out, right? Get it all figured out, get it under contract. Let's work together to make it happen. It's not as complex as we're all thinking.
Cool. And by figured out, you mean it's clear when the transaction's negotiated, is the seller contributing any percent or any dollar amount? And then you've also negotiated with the buyer that they're going to make up whatever potential difference or the full commission, get it all documented. And you're saying we'll figure out how to pay for it if we have to.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Honestly, if this is stopping from getting a deal done, we have other underlying issues that we need to take care of.
Okay.
Right? this should not be a roadblock or an impediment to getting a deal done.
Okay, really quick, just going through the BBA. The first section up here, very similar to what you've already seen. It has an end date. It also lists, you can narrow the scope of your buyer broker agreement within a particular county or specific property address that's built in. The one that you really care about though is I have an agreement with another broker on property X. So I might be showing them, 123 Main Street, but 456 Easy Street is being represented by a different agent. Because what we want to do is stop concurrent buyer broker agreements. Next slide really quick, Johnny. And then the compensation piece of it, again, there's a buyer obligation that if the seller does offer some in 2.2, that could offset what the buyer owes. And then when it's due and payable, and it's at closing. So anyway, that's all I wanted to talk about that on the buy side. There is another piece that is before you as buyer agents show a home, you must have a written agreement with them. UAR has chosen not to create a showing form. We as a brokerage may have a showing form that just says for showing services will do that. I'll probably I will borrow from Washington County Board. They've chosen to do a one-page form. It'll look very similar to this one, but it will say this is strictly for showing properties and it doesn't create agency. And so we're figuring out, Devin.
What about a listing agent showing an unrepresented buyer?
Listing agents are already covered because they have authorization from their seller to show their homes to anyone. And so it doesn't create agency on that at all. Yeah, you're good.
Suan?
On the buyers.
This absolutely puts the burden on a buyer. Buyers can be dopes and sign multiple buyer broker agreements and owe multiple commissions. And so we're trying to stop that because the division will actually come after you, the agents, for not having found out that the buyer has multiple buyer broker agreements or you've created that. This is where our professionalism will come in and we're going to have to be able to figure out probably is, have you been looking at homes in the last 6 months? And with whom? So that maybe you as a buyer agent would, I'm just using an example, may have to communicate with other agents. Do you have a written buyer broker with them?
Well, and they have to check mark it. That's right here at the top. They have to signify that last checkbox. No, I don't. That's my hope with this.
Yeah, I'm hoping that this is supposed to help protect us as agents too. Trust me, this is written by UAR.
Which, how many times have you heard from your buyer when you ask that? Because listing is very easy, right? Like, is it on the market? Like, it's very easy to audit if there's an active listing agreement. Like, buyer agreements has been this weird blurry area because buyer agents tend to neglect it at the beginning of the process. It's always later on or whatever. And how many times have you heard from a buyer be like, I signed some papers a while ago, but I don't think I'm under contract with any agent, right? I think the clarity of it having to be signed in a buyer appointment, similar to a seller or listing appointment, hopefully creates a different separation from, the monotony of seeing houses and looking at them, that maybe that clarity for the buyer is going to come in, but it is up to the buyer to please. Joel, and then over here.
I think it's a very good thing. I would not want to work with someone for 2 months, get down to signing a contract and have them say, oh, I actually did sign something and find out that I can't represent that buyer. To her point, as far as I have had one lawsuit where a brokerage tried to go after me for commission. And as soon as I provided the buyer broker agreement and with this verbiage that said that they represented that they did not have an agent, that lawsuit went away. So I'm not super worried that I'm going to have to police all this stuff. It's going to be on the buyer. It went right back to the buyer. I went to the brokerage and said the buyer indicated they didn't have an agent. Go sue them, and it was.
Yep. I 100% agree with the piece that I really like about this is it forces us and formalizes our relationship with a buyer right at that buyer appointment. And same thing. Do I really want to go leave my family at 7 p.m. to go show homes to Clay's clients in Magna? That's all where all of his clients came from. With the likelihood of them just being able to just ditch me, 3 appointments later or whatever, right? Okay.
The truth is we could get away with that, right? My buyer consultation has always been a bit of a party to come on, let's have, you're pre-approved, let's house search. You know, let's pull up the homes. It's fun. It's like one of the best parts of the job, and why a lot of us love being in real estate is helping buyers search for properties and dream a little, right? And so I have been guilty of spending 98% of the time of the buyer consultation talking about them and doing a consultation, and only 2% of the time doing a presentation of my value proposition. And Johnny is right. Like that time is over. Like, yeah, I'm still going to have a lot of fun, but they're because first of all, this has to be signed. I can't open a door unless this is signed. But second of all, because this plainly states, if the seller doesn't pay me, you pay me, buyer. I need to demonstrate my value and get very clear on why they could potentially have to write me a $10,000, $15,000 check, or at least a bridge that we're going to have to cross.
A lot of questions. Okay, Amber.
But a lot of it is new, and there will be unintended consequences to these forms because a lot of it, we're going in blind. We don't know what's going to happen. And so I would really appreciate your feedback as we start using these forms, and I can take that to the forms committee. These will evolve. These forms will evolve as the problems come up because we don't know what the problems are going to be. So tell me what the problems are when you get them.
Okay, Becca, and then up here.
So why can't we, as an industry and a profession, go into each deal assuming we're still having a buyer's side? Why aren't we the ones navigating this and the propelling forward, like teaching my seller, look, we're going to pay a buyer's agent. None of it's new. That's what I'm saying. Why has this gotten so crazy complicated? If none of this is new, we've always known it's been negotiable, but we haven't, like, I'm not going to try and sting if I'm listing agent, why am I going to try and sting a buyer's agent?
But there will be.
You just stated how many hours you are taking a buyer around compared to, we know the value's there. Why are we questioning? And also, how does that play into the price point of the home? We've always been appraising homes knowing that maybe 6% is going out. When you go in and you're trying to do your net sheet, you're putting those commissions in there. So now are you going in there and going, okay, to net now we can list lower.
Yeah.
Like our appraised values are going to,
That's what it sounds like.
I don't know, it's weird.
It's like, oh, there's three people who are gonna go up and down.
Like, so
While you're preaching, I hope the answer is no to every
yeah,
person
like,
in this room.
it feels like
but
we're
You are
assuming-
awfully trusting to assume that every agent in the industry will defend the buyer's agent. And the truth is we just won't know. It won't
Yeah,
be
and
disclosed on the MLS.
And as you read what's going out there, there are folks that are going to build their whole models, think brand age, that will build their whole model on, we're not going to have a buyer at all. That's CoStar's model, Becca.
So I have my first closing after the 17th. Do I need to add an addendum to my contract? Okay.
So back to the buyer appointment real quick. Are all three of you fully preparing your buyers that they will be fully compensating you when you leave that buyer appointment? If the seller contributes anything, that's a bonus, but you're trying to plant the expectation the buyer could fully pay you most likely. Is that how you guys are doing it? Or you're still trying to be in the middle of the ground of a seller might contribute to it? Dan's probably for sure. You leave the buyer appointment, buyer, you're paying me 3% commission.
They understand that they are ultimately responsible to make sure that the payment happens. With that being said, it's highly likely that we're going to be able to negotiate that the seller is paying it. But yeah, the buyer understands that they're responsible for it.
Okay. You guys echo that? What you're shaking your head a little bit.
Well, no, I think Dan's right. They've got to know that they owe it. But the reality is you don't know the deal you're going to have, if it's new construction, if the seller's offering, if it's not. And the truth is, at the end of the day, it probably will be negotiated or worked out with the lender. Like, yeah, it's going to have to be worked out.
I think it's very similar to what we're doing right now. I mean, all of my buyer agent agreements say 3%. I've had those conversations though, where we go and we see something who is paying 1% as a basic compensation, and I'll have that conversation with them. So I think I'm not going to say it's situational, but sometimes it's situational with depending on the type of deal.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not new, but what's new is now it's in their face. I could usually slide and not even have to have the conversation until they want to go look at a Lennar home. And now I'm like, oh, shoot, it's only a 1%. Like, we'll have to figure that out. But now it's like, no, we're talking about it with every conversation.
Okay.
Even though
Courtney and then Sue.
I'm gonna try to use my teacher voice.
Nobody's live, Dean.
Okay, so on the ERS, we can do up to. On the BBA, can we do up to 3%? No, we have to have the 3% and then just say we'll work it out if it's less than. Okay.
Okay, Saran.
Folks ahead of the curve, and we've been doing all this. Utah's been doing all this all along, but my question is, because I don't know this, but I probably should. The lawsuit that was initiated, wasn't it instigated by buyers? Oh, it was by sellers. Because at the end of the day, it's not going to help sellers. If they think that they're saving money, if they've got a lot of unrepresented buyers. They think, okay, that sort of answered my.
Thanks for saying what we've all been thinking for the last 6 months.
I mean, I think most of us that are busy and have been around a little bit, we've gotten to the point where we've represented people in like FSBO situations, right? As a buyer. And I think we'll be doing more of that where hey, I found this home off market. They've allowed us to come see a showing. We haven't talked about commissions with the seller yet. We'll have to decide at that point if you're willing to either make an offer and you pay me out of pocket, or if I'm willing to accept what the seller is willing to pay, or if we move on and find a different home. And I think there's going to need to be more of that going forward as a buyer's agent. Like, hey, they're only offering this. Do we want to move on to a new home, or are you willing to pay me the difference?
Okay, Colby Carr, just yelled out.
I've been sitting back here like stewing over like all of this. Like everybody is like, I walked into the room feeling like I knew what was going on. And I'm more confused than I've ever been in the last 6 months. Like, how did it get so confusing by just all these random questions? Like fundamentally, we're doing the exact same thing that we've been doing forever. The buyer is still paying our commission just in a different way. Like, how is it so confusing? Why am I losing my mind right now?
Too many tattoos.
There may not be an answer to that, but what I can tell you is that the buyer always brings the money to the table. Nothing happens unless we have a buyer.
Yes.
Yeah.
So when we're doing a CMA and we adjust these things for concessions, are we also adjusting them for commissions now? And we should be, because if some of these agents are trying to say, hey, I can get you this amount of money, but you're saying like, no, that was a sold comp that had a 6% commission on it. And now, I know we haven't done it before, but we've never done any of it before, So
and that won't be, but commissions will not be part of the MLS. You won't see what a buyer's compensation was, nor a listing compensation. No, it has nothing to do with the sales price.
Yeah, what about after the fact? That is a good question. After the closing, because we do disclose concessions, so now will
It's
we
not a
disclose
concession.
any?
That is not considered a concession from the MLS. This is a great one for Brad next week.
That's
So I think to bring it back to the front, I think part of this is like when you're looking at actually what did the lawsuit, what was the NAR agreement, all those things, what were the exact changes that it spit out to us? Like for the most part, those have been pretty simple and Dean's been going over those for weeks, right? I think the rabbit hole that we continue to go down is we're trying to interpret either the positive or the negative consequences, like culturally or conversation wise or whatever that might come out of this. Okay. So I think even trying to maybe just rapid fire summarize those because we're already at noon, but can we just hit like, in your opinion, like sellers, like what are the pros that come out of this for sellers? What are maybe some potential negatives? And then we'll just flip flop real quick to buyers to kind of summarize that as well. What are some of the pros that could come out of this for buyers? What are some of the negatives that we may be facing with buyers as well? So let's start with sellers, pros. What are the pro sides of these changes for sellers in transactions?
I think ultimately it is going to be some degree of downward pressure on total commission paid by the seller and shifting it from seller towards buyer.
Which means could be a possible increase in the net for sellers out there.
Potentially.
Okay. Any other pros for sellers that come to mind?
This is going to weed out the industry, and I think you'll have stronger listing agents and sellers will get better service rendered because you won't have the I do 2 deals a year agents really, I mean, they'll still be there, but it'll be tougher.
Whose first transaction was a buyer transaction? In the industry? Okay, whose was a seller transaction? Okay, maybe a third was sellers. Traditionally, your first transaction is a buyer, right? Because it's a little bit easier to kind of coast into that buyer transaction where there's a lot of formality, a lot of script, there's a lot of presentation of contracts. You got to have your stuff kind of dialed in, or even the casualness that sometimes my first buyer, I didn't know what the heck I was doing. I still.
You mean your only buyer?
My only buyer, okay. But now it's formalizing and requiring you to be as professional and have your value proposition and your scripts on explaining contracts dialed in on the buy side like it would be seller. So I do think the professional that's going to raise for that, the training required for agents getting in the business and staying in the business. So I do. Hopefully that's none of us, but these agents that are not trained that just fall backwards into transactions, it could be a negative consequence for them. Any pros or negatives on the seller side that you're seeing viewed from the seller lens?
I will add to answer a little more to Colby. The one nice thing with all of this is if a lot of this is going over your head on the seller side, keep doing business the same way you already have, explaining it, and you'll be okay. Like it really isn't that big of a change.
Okay, so flip to buyers real quick. Pros. You see any pros in this as we're talking through this? Is there pros to this decision?
I think it might show a little more transparency now. I think now we're forced to kind of like what Clay was saying before, where it was a little more casual, more of a party feel. I think we now have to dial in and maybe educate more. It's what's forcing us to educate. So I think buyers are now going to have maybe a better experience overall. If they have a good experience, they're going to have a better experience than they have in the past, because now we as agents have to be very mindful of going in that presentation so that they don't get to the end of a transaction. Because we all heard this before. Someone says, well, I bought this house, but I did all the work. My agent didn't do anything. I think we'll see less of that just because we now have to up our game. And so therefore the buyers, I hope, will get a better experience out of it.
Yeah, I think that it might be a little worse for buyers, then it could get a little bit better for that. Like when you go to sell your home, you look for the professionalism, experience, track record for a seller agent. Buyers, because they could coast into it. So it might force them to just interview more agents or just make sure they're finding a really good buyer agent that's going to help them. So yeah, they're represented better.
Yeah, I have a real quick one too for a positive for buyers, and that is for buyer agents. We really are going to have to up our game professionally. Doggone it, we actually, instead of texting somebody, we actually need to pick up the phone and call an agent. Now, that's also going to change on listing agents. They're going to have to be more professional in receiving those calls or communicating, because I know it's crazy. We should communicate. I was talking with an agent this morning, Cameron, I think it was you, that said, you get a guy calls, hey, 4 days ago, I sent an offer to you. Did you get it? We actually need to talk with our, with listing agents and buyer agents. I think that the level of professionalism will increase. And so I'm excited about that.
Bro, did you have a pro or con?
Let's just assume that this eventually goes to rat race to the bottom, but it's just trying to drill down, like they're not. And then the buyers are average, very strapped. Talk about it. Right, so it's very strapped on the buy side. How do you think this is gonna affect, those guys, I guess the first home buyers, the consumers that are already need the negotiation, needs that buyer agent, they can't afford it, sellers kind of ship words, kind of reduce that.
So, which is probably just alluding to what we're wrapping up with. So I guess what are the potential negative outcomes, which is probably the bigger category that you're going to try to be cautious of to help protect the buyers in your world?
That could be a real unintended consequence of the entire thing, that those underserved, communities out there and the first timers, it's going to be really, really difficult on them. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I have no idea what the solution is.
But we can address it. The temptation will never be greater for a buyer to go alone. That's the message that the news has already been sending. That's what the public is going to hear is you should go it alone, especially when we're putting these buyer contracts in front of them and say, whoa, that's a lot of money. I might have to pay it. And they will inevitably get to the conclusion of, if I just don't use a buyer's agent, I don't even have to negotiate it. I could get savings. There will be a temptation to go alone. And that's the big negative is first-time home buyers, people that aren't as familiar with this process really could set themselves up to be taken advantage of, to risk earnest money, to make big mistakes. But it's on us to deliver our value proposition and encourage them to understand that have the confidence in our ability to figure it out, as Eric said, to get it worked into the deal, to negotiate the seller to cover it and to figure it out. My hope and prayer is that we aren't having buyers paying out of pocket for buyer agency. Like, I think all of us would agree, if we can just do everything in our power to not let that become a reality, we win.
I think that is the spotlight
And the buyer wins.
on the negative consequence. And again, this is my opinion. There's no legal standing to this. I predict we're going to go in a little bit of a full circle on this because of the negative consequences for first-time home buyers. Like, again, anytime you're representing the seller and an unrepresented buyer walks in, you're like, heck yeah, we're going to go get a good deal for my seller or whatever, right? Or negotiating for a FSBO represented as a buyer, right? So I do think there's going to be first-time home buyers taken advantage of. I think they're gonna avoid agents, even though that might be the best thing for them because they think it's going to be overall more expensive. I think that the push puts the pressure on them how they're going to compensate for it. I think it's going to put pressure on loans. I think we're going to have to expose that a little bit over time, and then we're going to probably start seeing some sort of government intervention on figuring out how to try to protect them, just like down payment assistance grants and stuff like that on affordability issues, right?
This gives us a really good opportunity also and a reason to reach out to our SOI. A lot of times we don't like to do that. But if we're all confused, this is a great touch point to say, here's a reason why now is the best time ever to be using a buyer's agent. Let me dispel the myths for you. I think that starts to get a lot more attention.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. Anything else? Any last final comments? Okay. Any burning questions before we end? Brad, go ahead.
Everybody else probably knows this, but the offer of compensation agreement, is there anything on the MLS that says agents can attach that as a document? Or it's not part of the show? You put your offer of compensation listing agreement, essentially, you can put that as an attached document on the MLS. So people can look at it and see what it's up to.
No, you can't put compensation on the MLS. You could put it anywhere else. And look, I'll leave it at this, and because I know we're way over time. I have a son-in-law who's created an app right now for listing agents to put down what compensation their sellers might be willing to offer on a property. So all you would have to do as a buyer agent, insert a property address and go in there. It's almost an MLS. I'm just saying, you're going to see other tools. People will be listing that, just like the billboard we talked about. It could be anytime I list a property, you know you're going to get X.
Yeah, make it your reputation. If anyone sees one of Clay Winder's
Leaf Sterling
listings,
has
they
a
should have
great one.
confidence that a buyer agent commission was probably prepared, with the seller, something like that.
So we're going from a regulated disclosure of any sort of seller compensation to buyers to a very unregulated potential communication path. Yep. It's good. That's a good change. What's that?
At your compensation, but that comment wasn't obviously to the public of buyers looking. So when they pulled it up, they just thought they were looking at like $650. That was their budget. And then they said, and then I had to say, okay, now you have to add this much. And letting everyone add that. And they're like, oh, they quickly understood very fast. Oh, now that house is, 680, 690. Yes or no, can I afford it?
Okay. All right. Anything? What? Okay. Last bit. Thank you. Give our panel a hand.